Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to walk through our first growing season at the new house. And if you've been following along, you know that we moved to a new property in January. We had nothing in the form of any garden at all. So the first season was a bit of a question mark. We didn't know if the landscape was going to be ready to grow anything, to plant anything, to put any raised beds in, or when those raised beds would be ready. So I wanted to take you through just the thought process about that whole thing and what plan A was and what plan B was. And ultimately, we kind of ended up with a mix of both of those plans. And we had a pretty successful growing season, all in all. So we moved in January. We worked with a landscaping company that started in the spring. We lined that up probably sometime in February or March, knowing that they would be starting sometime in the spring. So I normally start my seeds indoors, which I did ultimately do, but my end result wasn't known at the time. So I knew for the first season I wanted to plant the usual stuff that I plant, which is herbs and tomatoes, usually a bunch of other things, spring crops, the whole summer thing, and something for fall. But for this season, kind of kept it on the simpler side just because we didn't know what was going to be ready. So plan B was growing tomatoes and herbs and maybe some spring stuff in containers on the back deck. So I still started my seeds indoors. I started my tomatoes, started the herbs, all of that. But what I wasn't sure of was come that May long weekend, which is when we typically transplant stuff outside because the weather allows us to do that, whether that was going to be in containers on the deck or whether it was going to be in the raised beds if they were ready. So what we ended up doing, the landscaping was completed sometime in June. So we ultimately did plant tomatoes and herbs and even some spring stuff out on the deck in containers, and it worked well. It's funny because my first foray into gardening or growing any kind of vegetable or herb or anything like that was 2009, a long time ago. And it was on my back deck in a couple of pots, and I didn't know what I was doing at the time. And it turned out like just a few things, right? 3 or 4 little pots, a couple of cherry tomatoes, some basil. And it turned out so well. That's kind of what got me hooked into the whole thing. And like they say, the rest is history. Now I've got all these raised beds and big plants. But at the time, I knew it was doable because I've done it before. And I had done it since, usually just vegetables in the raised beds and some herbs and that. In containers. So I knew it was possible. And that's what we did for the first growing season here. We had tomatoes, we had herbs. I even grew some lettuce in a pot in a container, and it turned out really good. I'll show you some of that in a second. And then when the raised beds were ultimately ready, the first things we planted were the berry bushes because we knew they needed time to establish and produce. So we took up 4 of those raised beds just for the fruit, for the berry bushes. And then we had 4 extras. One was going to be for garlic in the fall, which was already reserved to start that routine again. And then the other 3, I ended up planting some things not too successfully, just because it was a little bit later in the season and I didn't start anything indoors to get a jump on that timing. But at least everything that grew on the deck and the berries did really well. Okay, so let me walk you through. I'll throw up some pictures on screen. Guys, I can't wait to take you outside when the new season starts, but it is snowy and cold and there's not much to see right now, but hang in there. And we'll get to some fun videos as soon as we start planting some things. Okay, so this is the lettuce. This was a Butter Crunch variety. I think I planted, well, it looks like I planted 5. And this turned out really well. And we do the cut and come again. So you just let it grow and you harvest the outside leaves, and eat whenever you want lettuce, you just go and grab some leaves outside and they just keep growing. And that turned out really well. I had planted some, arugula as well. That's in the pot next to it. And this was, when was this? This must have been probably maybe in April. It was before the May long weekend because lettuce likes the cooler temperature. So this must have been sometime planted outside, probably sometime in April. And the picture was probably sometime in May. Now these were my tomatoes. I started them inside, transplanted them into 8 pots. There were 7 cherry tomatoes and 1 slicer. And I call this my tomato row. And Now it looks very tame, but as the season progressed, it got a little jungly out there, but it was fun. And we have to stake them up because they're vining plants, and we had to tie the stakes to the railing. We did that with twine just so that they wouldn't topple over. So these were, yeah, and the cherry tomatoes, the varieties I planted or I seeded were Sun Sugar, Sweet 100, and Midnight Snack. And then the slicer was a Celebrity Tomato, and they turned out really well. So these were our 8 tomato plants for the season. You see the herbs in the background there. I have a better shot. So for herbs, I mean, the big bushy thing, that's chamomile. I like to dry that. I like to grow it and dry it for herbal tea. To the right, there's 2 basil. There's probably 2 or 3 plants in each of those pots. And then from left to right, we have 2 parsley, a lemon balm, a mint, and an oregano. Most of these were started inside. The only one I purchased, I got a start, was the oregano, just because I didn't have seeds to start them. But everything else I started indoors and then transplanted out. Did I do the chamomile? I actually think I started the chamomile indoors as well. And everything did really well. Like the herbs did fine, harvested over the course of the season. Picking the flowers for the chamomile, and the mint and the lemon balm I also grow to dehydrate the leaves for tea. And then the parsley was, snipping some every time we wanted to add some to a meal. Same thing with oregano. And then basil, similar for basil, we use it for fresh eating, and then closer to the end of the season when the plants are getting a little bit big, just harvested larger batches to make some pesto and put it in the freezer. This is a few more weeks in. You can see that the raised beds, we've only completed the 4 at this point, and we added the other 4 later. So I knew we weren't going to be ready in time to put our tomatoes out into raised beds, which was fine. Plan B in containers, I know it although it wasn't ideal, it actually worked pretty well. They were living their best life in these containers, and it was all fresh soil, and I think they did really well. These were, okay, so this was the berry bushes, and we ended up covering them. These are the blueberries, just to protect them from the birds. And you'll see there's these little red rocks that I painted them and scattered them throughout the berry bushes just to try to prevent them, to use them as decoys for the birds to think that they're strawberries, and then they'd pick at them, realize that they weren't real berries. And it kind of worked, but I ended up adding some additional protections. The blueberries, we did just this mesh netting, and we used some different things for the strawberries, which I'll show you in a second. But that turned out really well. We got a lot of blueberries that first year. I didn't count how many, like in terms of, weight or number or anything like that, but it was more than I thought. So I think these plants were about 2 years old when we bought them. And this is the clover. So when we first finished the landscaping, made sure, the fence, the soil, all that pad where all the raised beds are, the outer border was seeded with clover. And this was probably in, I want to say sometime it must be the middle of June at this point. And it turned out really well. Like, it looks so green, and it stayed green throughout the season and looks so lush back there. It's really pretty. I'm really happy with that decision. Tomato row. This is probably at its peak at this point. This is probably mid-July. And they were getting a little scraggly. I did some pruning, over the course of the season. And what I didn't realize at the time, which I probably should have, and it didn't occur to me at the time, was they are vining plants, right? So when I was harvesting, I'd harvest the front, but then there's branches that obviously are going to grow through the railing and drape down below. So when I'd go out to harvest, I'd bring my bowl, I'd harvest the top from the deck, and then go down the stairs and go and pick the tomatoes that were hanging over the deck behind them. Anyway, it was funny, but they turned out really well. And honestly, like, even looking back to my previous gardening at the old house, these plants did really well here. And I don't know if it's probably a combination of things. Obviously it was all new soil. It was all new soil. There's more rain here in general, and it's not as hot as where we used to go. We'd get days where it was 30 plus, which is 30 Celsius, 90-ish Fahrenheit. So it used to get pretty hot. You'd be watering like at least every day, day and a half. But yeah, the plants did really well. This is obviously further along in the season. Parsley's starting to look a little worse for wear. I started more basil in that third pot there in the front, the little green one. Basil's doing good. Chamomile is going crazy. I would have to harvest almost every couple of days at this point to get the little blooms out, and then to just dry them out for tea. The mint and the oregano, everybody was doing good. It went really well. Strawberries, you guys. This was the first time I had ever grown them. I had started with, this is like a cloche thing, but they were too small, so I ultimately chose a different protection just to make it easier to just cover the whole bed with the netting. And I think that's in the next picture. But this was really nice, like just going out in the morning, grabbing, berries to eat to add to your breakfast or whatnot, or just eat them standing right next to the raised bed. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. Okay, so in that you'll see there's like a little strip of soil between the clover and the garden bed beam. And the plan there was either perennial or something that was either really fragrant or that would deter critters if they got in, if they got into the fence, at least something around the border that would, act as some kind of deterrent. So I ended up finding a deal for lavender, which we love lavender. And it was like 3 for $10. So I said, you know what, wouldn't it be great if we just plant the whole border with lavender? So I stocked up, I think I got like 24. And then we just, spread them out evenly around the whole border and planted lavender. 3 for 10. What was it? 3 for $10. That's a great deal. And it's going to be beautiful. We'll have to see if they all survived the winter. That we planted this, let me think. This was probably in August at this point. So they had some time to establish, after I planted them, there was enough time there for them to, settle in, establish, kept them watered, for the first little while. And then we'll see. And then winter came, and then I have no idea. This is one of those things that you just never know. And we'll see. We'll see if they all come back this year. But that's going to be beautiful. I can't wait to see it. This is also, this is just showing the right side. And we've got blackberries on the bottom right, which didn't produce that much, maybe just a handful. And then you'll see that green netting with the hoops. That's what I ultimately switched over those strawberry cloches. I said, it's just going to be easier to do it this way. And that worked out really well. And then you can just, lift the netting, reach in, harvest, and close it up again. And the birds didn't touch anything. Well, obviously, once that was in, and then the netting for the blueberries, things were left alone. The third bed is where I ultimately planted garlic. And there's not yet, though. Right now, I think it's empty. And then the last one, I had started some bok choy, some cabbage, but again, it was a little bit late in the season at that point, so it was that didn't turn out too well. But that's okay. You win some, you lose some. This was from afar, and you'll see there's 2 little teepees there on the back left. Those were for green beans or pole beans. I did some green ones, did some yellow ones. And that did okay. But again, a little late to be starting beans. We got maybe a few handfuls. And by then it was getting, frost was becoming a problem. But just looking at this photo now with the fruit trees in the back and the 8 raised beds that we ended the season with the clover, made me happy. This was a very happy sight to wake up to every morning, I'll tell you that. Especially not knowing if we were going to have a season at all. Like it was just one of those things, and I think we did pretty good for a season that just we didn't know what was going to happen. Tomato row. This is close to the end of the season now, and it's the jungle continues. This is right before they started turning. When it gets close enough to the middle or the end of the fall, there when things start to turn yellow, blight starts to rear its ugly head. But they held their own. They stuck it out. I was really impressed with how well they did. And when you can come outside, come in with a bowl full of tomatoes like this is probably about 2 harvests. And most of what we grow is cherry tomatoes, and I like doing them also like different colors because it looks so good. And making either salads or pasta dishes, or it's just amazing. We love cherry tomatoes, and we typically don't buy them from the store because they just don't taste the same. Like if you know, you know. That homegrown tomatoes, there's nothing like it. This was a small harvest of blueberries. Once they were producing, we would be harvesting probably a little bowl like this every 3 days. It was really nice. They were really tasty. This was near the end of the season. We'd get like a handful of beans, maybe the odd strawberry, the odd raspberry that was still there. This was probably one of the last little bits of harvest from the season. And then the garlic. So planted cloves in that raised bed in October with the plan that we'll be harvesting garlic scapes in June, garlic bulbs in July sometime. And that's probably one of the things that I missed the most was not having garlic on hand. I haven't had to buy garlic in a really long time, so not having it because we knew we were moving, so I didn't plant any at the old house to harvest this year. So we're starting the cycle again, planted some garlic in October, and looking forward to being able to harvest them and having them, cure them, and then just have them for like 6 to 8 months almost. In the next video, I'll be talking about the plans that we have for phase 2 of the landscaping. Now that the back is done, we're going to start focusing on, finishing the raised beds in the back. We still have 6 to add. And then on the south side of the property, just starting to plan out, landscaping, flower beds, all the other things like that. Lots of things to do, but I'm pretty confident that at least the growing season is going to be successful. All our stuff is going to be ready. The raised beds are there. I'm probably still going to plant some things in pots on the back deck just for convenience, like herbs and that, so that I can just step outside my kitchen and grab some things for cooking when I'm making meals and whatnot. But for the most part, I've already planned out my whole garden plan and what we're going to be planting in what garden, in what raised bed, and at what time. You know what? Maybe I'll cover that in a separate video as well, because that's a whole process too. I'm planning on starting my seeds either this weekend or next for the spring crops. So yeah, it's the best time of year, the start of garden season for any gardener out there. Thanks for watching.